When a small nation dares to say no to the most powerful institution on earth, who blinks first? The United Nations gave the order. Burkina Faso tore it apart. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't answer with words. He answered with silence. And then, with fire. No debate, no backroom deals. Just one message burned into the global chessboard. We will not obey. Within hours, panic rippled from Geneva to Washington. Was this just defiance, or the beginning of something much bigger? Because here's the question no one dares to say aloud. If one African nation can reject the UN, what happens when 3 or 10 follow? The fuse is lit, and this time, it's not a protest. It's a warning. UN orders and Traoré's response. The United Nations has rules, not laws. Rules, written in polished language, wrapped in the silk of diplomacy, but enforced with chains just as strong as steel. Every African leader knows the script. Step 1. Liberalize your markets. Step 2. Privatize your resources. Step 3. Export raw goods at bargain prices. Step 4. Beg for foreign aid when poverty follows. For decades, African governments sign these directives like students copying the answers to a test. And, for decades, their people remained poor while foreign corporations grew rich. But this time, the classroom rebelled. When the UN delivered its latest set of economic recommendations to Burkina Faso, it expected silence, compliance, and another rubber stamp. Instead, it received a rejection so blunt that diplomats in Geneva were left stunned. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't simply refuse. He flipped the entire equation. The UN told him to maintain cotton export quotas that keep French textile giants supplied while Burkinabe farmers starve. Traoré's answer: we'll find new buyers or process it ourselves. The UN advised him to attract more loans to stabilize government accounts. Traoré's answer: we'll cut the debt trap, not tighten it. The UN insisted that Burkina Faso continue hosting foreign forces to secure its territory. Traoré's answer: we'll defend our soil with our own hands, or not at all. It was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was mathematics. Because here's the truth. Under UN-approved frameworks, Africa loses $88 billion every year in illicit financial flows. More money leaves the continent through debt repayments and profit extractions than arrives through aid and investment. In Traoré's words, it's simple. 2 + 2 has never equaled 5, not for Africa. And that was the match. Within days, Mali's Assimi Goïta added fuel to the fire. He reminded the world that French and UN troops spent 13 years in Mali, and terrorism only spread wider. His solution? Expel foreign forces. Build regional strength. Niger's leadership followed. They declared that Niger would handle its own affairs, without UN supervision. Suddenly, 3 nations, the heart of the Sahel, stood shoulder to shoulder, daring the world to look them in the eye. One no had become a chorus. And it wasn't just about Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger. The echo traveled across the continent, in Ghana, in Senegal, in Chad. Whispers spread. If they can say no, why can't we? For the first time in decades, Africa was not negotiating within the frame of UN authority. It was rejecting the frame itself. This wasn't a protest in the streets. This was leadership at the highest level tearing up the global script. But with defiance comes danger. Every African leader knows the cautionary tales. Thomas Sankara, gunned down after refusing World Bank dictates. Patrice Lumumba, assassinated for demanding Congo's resources serve Congolese people. Muammar Gaddafi, eliminated after proposing a united African currency. History carved a cruel warning into stone. Leaders who say no don't last long. Traoré knows this. Goïta knows this. Niger's generals know it too, and yet they still lit the match, because in their eyes, obedience is slower death than defiance. What the UN calls recommendations, these leaders see as shackles. What Geneva calls development, they see as dependency, and they are not willing to pass those chains to the next generation. This is why their no rings so loudly, not because it is defiant, but because it is final. No more structural adjustment programs, no more foreign oversight of African elections, no more peacekeepers who guard mines while villages burn. This is the moment when 3 African nations told the world, "We will not survive by your permission. We will survive by our choice." The United Nations thought it was dealing with states too small to resist. But every empire forgets this truth. Even the smallest spark can start the largest fire. And now, that fire has jumped borders. The fire leaps borders. Who can contain it? The silence didn't last long. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré tore up the UN directive, the echo reached every power center on Earth. First came the statements, polished, rehearsed, but trembling beneath the surface. Geneva called it an unfortunate deviation from international cooperation. Washington labeled it a concerning turn toward instability. Paris went further, a dangerous rise of authoritarianism. Words carefully chosen, yet the fear behind them was raw. Because what had begun as a single defiant no was no longer contained inside Burkina Faso. It was now a storm crossing borders. Western media launched its first strike. Traoré became the new villain of the Sahel. Headlines described him as a strongman, a military dictator, a coup leader clinging to power. No mention of the tens of thousands filling Ouagadougou's streets to support him. No mention of the farmers who finally saw a leader willing to defend their crops, their soil, their dignity. Instead, the narrative was set. If Africa defies, it must be chaos. But on the ground, the story was different. In Ouagadougou, crowds carried portraits of Traoré, chanting, "Our land, our choice." In Bamako, Mali, young men marched with banners reading "No to Foreign Orders." In Niamey, Niger, mothers and children joined demonstrations demanding sovereignty, not charity. The West called it manipulation. Africans called it liberation. This was the climax, the collision of 2 realities. On one side, the polished boardrooms of Europe and America, writing reports about African instability. On the other, the dust and sweat of the Sahel, where people saw for the first time in decades a leader who refused to bow. But history loomed like a shadow. Every chant in the streets carried a silent fear. Would Traoré share the fate of Sankara, Lumumba, Gaddafi? Would the hand of foreign intelligence reach once again into African politics, silencing a movement before it spread too far? The possibility was real. Already, whispers of sanctions moved through diplomatic channels. Aid packages threatened to vanish. Bank accounts abroad froze without warning. The machinery of pressure was turning. And yet, the fire didn't die, because something irreversible had happened. When the people of Burkina Faso saw their leader defy the UN, they realized that sovereignty was not an abstract dream. It was flesh. It was breath. It was possible. And Mali felt the same. Niger felt the same. 3 voices were now one, and that terrified the world. The United Nations itself was caught in contradiction. For decades, it had branded itself as the defender of democracy. Yet here it was, condemning leaders with massive popular support simply because they refused to obey. If democracy means government by the people, then how could the UN call Traoré illegitimate while his people filled the streets in his name? The answer was obvious. Democracy, in the UN script, meant leaders who obeyed external orders. Anything else was dangerous. And so, the climax sharpened. Was this movement the rebirth of African sovereignty, or the opening chapter of its destruction? International contractors, mining companies, and arms dealers watched nervously. Every year of instability meant billions in profit. Every African leader who expelled them meant billions lost. Peacekeepers, aid consultants, financial experts all saw their business models collapsing if the Sahel truly broke free, so they tightened the pressure. Stronger narratives, harsher sanctions, silent threats. But in the streets, the chants only grew louder, because once a people have tasted the word no, it cannot be untasted. And that's what makes this climax so volatile. The UN, the West, and global institutions are standing at the edge of a wildfire they cannot control. One spark in Burkina Faso has already lit Mali and Niger. If it spreads further to Chad, to Senegal, to Ghana, the entire architecture of post-colonial control may collapse in real time. This is no longer about cotton quotas or gold exports. It is about the survival of an empire of rules versus the birth of a continent's independence. And the question is no longer if, it's when. When hunger fails to break a nation, the fire had crossed borders. But in Burkina Faso itself, the heat was immediate. Sanctions fell like rain, aid suspended, foreign accounts frozen, international contracts suddenly under review. Banks whispered of restricted transfers. International media predicted collapse within months. The message was clear: obey or starve. And yet, something unexpected happened. The people did not break. Instead, they adjusted. Markets in Ouagadougou began filling with locally grown produce. Farmers shifted from export quotas to feeding their own nation. For the first time in decades, Burkinabe agriculture fed Burkinabe mouths. The Western narrative insisted famine was coming, but in the streets, families spoke of dignity. They said, "Better to eat little and free than full and chained." This was the civil consequence. Scarcity, yes, but also sovereignty. Politically, the shift was even sharper. The very isolation designed to weaken Traoré instead hardened his image at home. Each sanction, each headline from Paris or Washington became proof that the outside world feared him. The more they condemned, the more his people rallied. It was a paradox the UN did not expect. Pressure strengthened the man they wanted to break. Inside Burkina Faso, the military tightened its unity. Officers who once doubted Traoré now saw him as the only shield between their nation and foreign domination. The streets, once fractured, began to chant with one voice, "No surrender!" And in neighboring Mali and Niger, the same transformation unfolded. The Sahel Alliance, once dismissed as symbolic, began to solidify. Intelligence sharing expanded. Joint patrols guarded borders. Talks of a shared currency, independent of France's CFA franc, surfaced openly. This was the political consequence, a movement that sanctions could not isolate, but only unify. But unity carried risks. With each step away from the UN, the Sahel states also stepped further from Western protection and finance. Hospitals strained under shortages. Schools lacked supplies once provided by aid programs. International NGOs withdrew, leaving gaps in medicine, food distribution, even clean water projects. The cost was real. Children went without textbooks. Clinics went without antibiotics. Families felt the weight of defiance in their daily lives. And yet, even in hardship, support held. Why? Because the people remembered the years of compliance. They remembered overflowing aid programs that somehow left villages starving. They remembered peacekeepers who guarded mines while markets burned. They remembered debt packages that promised stability and delivered only chains. To them, the current pain was not a punishment for rebellion. It was the cost of finally breaking free. Civil society began to reorganize. Local cooperatives replaced foreign NGOs. Traditional leaders mediated conflicts in the absence of international agencies. Universities introduced courses on food sovereignty and indigenous governance. The country was not collapsing, it was mutating. Politically, the shift was even deeper. Traoré's refusal of the UN was no longer seen as policy, it was identity. He had become the embodiment of resistance, the living symbol of a nation reclaiming itself. This terrified the UN far more than any military maneuver. Because history shows that once a leader becomes myth, sanctions lose power. Sankara had become myth. Lumumba had become myth. Gaddafi had become myth. And now, Traoré was walking the same path. The civil consequence, hunger and hardship, tempered by resilience. The political consequence, unity and symbolism, tempered by danger. Because every day Traoré survived, his defiance grew stronger, and every day he grew stronger. The fear in foreign capitals grew sharper. The UN's dilemma was clear. Crush him too hard, and he becomes immortal. Ignore him, and the fire spreads. The people of Burkina Faso had chosen. They would rather walk hungry and free than kneel full and enslaved. And that choice is the most dangerous weapon of all. How one voice shook the world order. In Washington, the alarm bells rang first. The State Department released a carefully worded statement about regional instability, but behind closed doors, the concern was sharper. If Burkina Faso could reject the UN, then American influence in Africa was weaker than anyone had admitted. For decades, U.S. strategy in the Sahel was indirect. The United Nations and France carried the public face, while America supported quietly through military training programs, intelligence sharing, and financial leverage. If those pillars cracked, Washington risked losing access to one of the richest resource corridors on Earth. And it wasn't just about gold or cotton. It was about uranium. It was about cobalt. It was about the minerals that powered American technology, American energy security, even America's defense industry. The CIA briefings grew darker. If the Sahel alliance holds, one analyst warned, the West may lose its last grip on African resources. Europe, meanwhile, trembled for a different reason. Paris, once the unchallenged master of West Africa's economy, saw its influence evaporating in real time. The franc CFA, the currency it designed to keep African economies tethered, was now openly challenged. French companies that once enjoyed monopolies on cotton and uranium contracts suddenly faced eviction. Brussels worried too. A united Sahel bloc meant stronger negotiating power in trade talks with the European Union. The old model, divide Africa, sign unequal deals, was collapsing. Even Beijing and Moscow watched closely. China saw opportunity, new markets, new contracts, new access without Western competition. Russia saw something deeper, the chance to rewrite the security map of Africa, replacing peacekeepers with partnerships. The world had shifted, and everyone knew it. But for the U.S., the dilemma was the hardest. Intervene openly and risk fueling anti-American sentiment that was already boiling in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. Step back and risk losing the region entirely to new powers. And then came the question no one wanted to say out loud. Would the U.S. support another soft coup to remove Traoré? It had happened before. Sankara, Lumumba, even Gaddafi, though not by U.S. hands alone, was removed with Western blessing. The playbook existed. The precedent was clear. But the risk was higher now. Traoré was not isolated. He was protected by an alliance, by regional solidarity, and, most dangerously, by popular support. Removing him could ignite not calm, but war. In Washington, war rooms, the conclusion was grim. Every path carries danger, and every delay strengthens him. The global stage had become a trap. America and its allies stood at the edge of a chessboard where one wrong move could turn a local defiance into a continental revolt. And yet, the match kept burning. Who will burn in this fire tomorrow? The match was struck in Ouagadougou, but the fire now lights the horizon of an entire continent. What began as one man rejecting a directive has become a question echoing through Africa. Do we govern ourselves, or do we remain governed? The United Nations still issues its warnings. Western capitals still release their statements. Sanctions still bite. But something fundamental has shifted. The illusion of control has cracked. Because for the first time in decades, Africans are watching leaders who do not beg, who do not kneel, who do not sign away their people's future. And once that image is seen, it cannot be unseen. Burkina Faso may be small. Its GDP, its population, its military, all modest on a global scale. But history is not written by size. It is written by fire. And Traoré has lit one. The future now hangs in a dangerous balance. If the Sahel Alliance holds, the UN faces a crisis of legitimacy greater than anything in its history. If it fails, Burkina Faso risks isolation, poverty, even collapse. The West is betting on collapse. The people of Burkina Faso are betting on survival. And somewhere between those two wagers lies the fate of a continent. But here's the truth Washington, Paris, and Geneva fear most. The hunger has not broken them. The pressure has not silenced them. And every day they endure, the fuse burns shorter. So what comes next? Will more nations join the defiance? Will sanctions give way to negotiations? Or will the empire of rules launch one final strike to snuff out the flame? Nobody knows. Not yet. But one thing is certain. The story of Africa's sovereignty is no longer hidden in conference rooms. It is on the streets. It is in the voices of farmers, soldiers, students, mothers. It is alive. The fuse still burns. The fire still grows. The question is not if it explodes, but who will be standing when it does. If one lone wolf can change the pack, what happens when the whole savannah rises? Don't just watch history. Be part of it. Share this fire. Keep it alive. And let the world know Africa will not kneel. This is not the end. It is the ignition. And the fuse is still burning.